Hi, welcome to Untold Alternatives, the podcast where we explore beyond the obvious, beyond the noise, and beyond convention, towards the possibilities that lie just beyond our gaze. With every conversation, we trade certainty for curiosity and uncover new, just, and sustainable ways of seeing the world and relating with society. I'm Christian Igbege, a doctoral researcher and your host on Untold Alternative Podcast. On this episode, I have the pleasure of speaking to Julian Weiss, who is a doctoral researcher and a consultant in circular economy. Julian, what have you been involved in lately? Would you help me throw some light on your background?
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk to you about circular economy and hopefully make this topic, which can be a bit complex and abstract sometimes, a little more accessible. My background is a pretty basic business background. First of all, I studied in business schools and did my bachelor's and master's there. And throughout my master's, I kind of discovered the topic of circular economy for myself. And back then, there were many options for studying circular economy. Even sustainability was kind of an up-and-coming topic at universities back then. And so I tried to find opportunities of learning about it, ultimately ended up co-founding a small startup, worked there for a year, had some consulting experience, and then decided to further deepen my knowledge and started a PhD on circular economy, specifically circular business models. And that's what I'm currently still doing, hopefully finishing this year, and also working in other projects, including standardization, which we might get into, but it's a whole nother can of worms.
Interesting. That sounds like a lot. You must be really motivated and really passionate about this because you've been involved in a lot from academy to industry, obviously.
I think I'm somebody who likes to understand problems from multiple angles, and so I always was interested in seeing different things, and I've had a short internship in a public sector administration, so I really like to get different points of views, and so that's my motivation, and but always trying to revolve around the topic of circular economy.
Interesting. Now, the topic of circular economy is actually one that is very trendy. You'd come across it in almost every field in current academic discourse.
Yeah.
But when it comes to society, which is actually, I think, what's going to be the focus of our conversation, because I want us to talk about circular economy in everyday life. Mm-hmm. So we'll be bringing the concept from the theoretical world into more practice and societal relations. But let's start from the very foundation or from the very basic. When you hear of circular economy, what does the phrase actually mean beyond the theoretical framing or industrial conceptualizations?
Mm-hmm. It's actually very simple. Circular economy is an economic model that's based on nature. So what nature does is it grows a plant, and then the plant interacts. For example, insects come to the plant and eat the nectar, and they distribute the pollen of the plant. And then eventually the plant dies, and then there's other organisms that come and take the plant apart. And the resulting earth basically is the feedstock for the next plant. And this idea has been around for a very long time. Also, if you think about maybe our parents or grandparents, when they repair certain clothing items, maybe a grandma fixing your socks when they have a hole in them, or trying to reuse packaging from something that, I don't know, you got your Amazon delivery and you're using it to box a present for somebody on Christmas or something like that. All of these are examples for a circular economy, and now it's really being brought into a broader scope because we're seeing how we're using our resources very inefficiently. And indeed, a lot of times design based on nature is the most efficient way of doing things, because nature has had millions and millions of years of perfecting these mechanisms. And us humans are actually just starting to learn how nature is doing these things and applying that to our everyday life and business as well.
Interesting. And I think that historical reflection you took is very important, because sometimes it could be very tempting to think about the concept as something that is entirely new. But from your short historical reflection, it's obvious that it's been with us for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And so, but before I move to the next question, what do you think is happening with, or is there any difference with the current model of circular economy that is being discussed, or it's just a continuation of what has been with us for a while?
I think it's partially a move back to traditions, and it's also a step forward in a new direction. And so what I mean by that is, I do think that there are some things like the practices I described, fixing a broken clothes or reusing certain items in your household instead of just trashing and rebuying something. So these are old practices. This is nothing new. But what we're doing differently now, after several decades of kind of forgetting about those old traditions and growing an economy that is now so large and complex that you cannot really go back to a time, I don't know, 150, 200 years ago before the Industrial Revolution. So now we have to combine basically those old practices with the industrial capacity, with digital technologies that we have developed in the last 150 years, to create something that I would probably call like a smart circular economy, which goes beyond what our grandparents have done. So I don't think anybody credibly currently calls for just going back, devolution back to the old ways, but I think it's about combining the best elements of both, to create something that is more efficient, but also more ethical, ultimately more social and more sustainable.
That's really interesting. Now, coming down again to the real world, how did you personally first encounter the idea of circular economy?
Yeah. Well, I think partially it's because my parents were already a bit sustainability minded, so I think they definitely thought about certain things, like maybe buying more regional food or things like that. So a little bit I was already predisposed to those topics, but I don't think we discussed it like structurally or systematically at the dinner table. So the way I found it and the way I also moved towards it in my professional life is, I actually started studying marketing and branding in my bachelor's degree. So very typical business bachelor's degree. And there I realized at some point, okay, what I'm doing here is I'm learning how I can make people buy more stuff and consume more stuff. And some of the things that you do marketing for, I realized this is things that you really don't need for a good life. And so this is kind of where it started, where I was questioning what I was actually studying to become. And in this process, I thought about, okay, what can I do instead that is still in this business world, which is interesting to me personally, which is something I wanted to work in, a field I wanted to contribute to, but in a way that does not create just more useless consumption, but something that is a little more meaningful, I guess. And that's where I started to look towards sustainability, and then I looked for job opportunities, internships in that field, and the first thing I really was able to do was to work at a research institute that did focus on circular economy a lot, and that's kind of how I learned about the topic more in detail.
Interesting. Now, people will often think about circular economy as something that is exclusively for big corporations or maybe business organizations, policymakers, and the likes. But what does it actually look like in everyday life, or how does it play out in our everyday choices?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think, first of all, I do want to say that it is probably impossible for most people to live a fully circular life at this time. So I think the biggest changes, they do need to happen on a more grand level, on a more systemic level. So I think what individual people can do, what's most effective, is to vote for politicians who support circular economy policies, and to also talk to their representatives about these issues, about wanting to consume more consciously. I think that is the biggest lever that all of us individuals have. But beyond that, what does circular economy look like in your everyday life? Well, it is those things that I described earlier, the practices that we maybe know from our grandparents or parents, who are careful about throwing stuff out and think about how can I maybe reuse this for something else. But it also can look a little more innovative. So, for example, there is a startup actually from my hometown of Cologne, Germany, called Vital. And they do something that also other startups do, but they have reusable takeout food packaging. So, and how their system works is, instead of just going to a place or getting delivery with single-use packaging. So we probably all know the containers that we get when we get takeout. The containers usually are thrown out afterwards. Maybe we'll reuse them once or twice, but the plastic is a bit thin, so you cannot really use it for a long time. Instead of those containers, they provide more durable alternatives. So these are basically like your typical lunch boxes. And then at no extra cost, this lunchbox is assigned to your account. You make an account with their app. And within 10 days, I think you have to return the item to any of the participating restaurants. So it's a little bit of extra work, which I understand that not everybody wants to do that. But if you live in a more urban area in Germany, and I think they've expanded to several other countries already, and I'm sure this exists in other countries as well, with other companies, then you, if you live in an urban area, you can take your packaging that you got your food delivery in and just bring it to a cafe or restaurant, maybe on your way to work, and turn it back. And it doesn't have to be the same one. I think this level of convenience is very important, and that's where I think circularity is still difficult for the everyday person. But I think this is one example where we can leverage digital platforms and apps together with this idea of reusing something rather than throwing it away.
So usually when people think about the roles individuals have to play in this concept, it's always about sacrifices. It's always conceptualized as we need to make sacrifices and things like that. Are there any simple shifts an average person can make towards living a more secular life without necessarily feeling like a huge sacrifice is being made?
I think so. I mean, you can definitely buy more secondhand. And for some, this might feel like a sacrifice, but I started buying more secondhand clothing a few years ago, and I have to say, I found the most interesting pieces of clothing I own in secondhand shops, and I pay half the price I do for fast fashion items. So I think ultimately it's a win-win once you get used to maybe a slightly different way of shopping. You have to look through the stuff a little bit more, but honestly, if you're on an app of H&M or Zara online, you're also looking through stuff for quite some time. So I don't think it's an additional time invest, and you actually save money. So I think buying secondhand is one thing, and then also thinking about getting your stuff repaired instead of buying it new, and that can also be cheaper. It maybe is a little extra effort, but also going to the store and buying a new item is an effort. So you might as well bring it to a repair shop, and you might be surprised by how many actually repair shops are around you that might fix a sewing machine, or they might fix your coffee maker. And there's so many secondhand marketplaces out there as well, and also refurbished electronics, which is something that's even higher quality than just secondhand. There's also a lot of marketplaces for that out there. So a lot of people I know have bought their phones from refurbished places, and they usually also give you a guarantee for your new device. So it's not just like secondhand where you just buy it and hope for the best, but you actually get a 1 to 3 year guarantee on your product that it will also last. So it's basically as good as new. I think these are some simple things.
Interesting. Practically what you've described is the lifestyle in some developing economies. I guess you know that. And
Sure.
Typically they don't call it circular economy, or they don't conceptualize it as such. Mm-hmm. Some people even see it as suffering or hardship or low life. I mean, but it's super interesting that this has become a real-time solution to some of the global challenges we are facing, especially as it relates to the planet. For instance, repairs. You talked about repairs. You talked about buying from second-hand shops. I mean, it's this is really it's really bringing me lots of memories about how back in my country we have shoe cobblers who help to mend your shoes when once there is any challenge. Back then, I don't know how it is now, anyways. But back then, I know that usually when you have any opening around your shoe, you can simply give it to these guys and they get it fixed. And they are always all around the place. Sometimes you find some of them in static shops, others are hawking, going around and getting things fixed. And also the same goes on to, I mean, with clothes also. So typically people don't wear clothes once and just throw it out. People usually wear their clothes, and if it has any tears or whatsoever, they get it fixed. But while I acknowledge that, I think that at the moment that culture seems to be going down the drain. People now are more materially driven. They want to, get the next piece of clothes. They want to wear clothes for just once. And it takes me to the issue of capitalism. How would you relate capitalism to the challenges that people face or that we face in terms of implementing circular economy?
Yeah, that's a very big question. But I mean, first of all, to what you said about developing countries or developing economies, I definitely understand how that way of circular living, even if it's not called circular, can feel like it's less than, because of all the media we consume that tells us that we have to buy stuff new and that only the latest trends are acceptable. So I totally understand this kind of perspective of it, and I think what we have to somehow achieve is a cultural shift of viewing reused or recycled things as something that can be precious or that carries history or that carries emotional value as well. And I think a lot of people do look at certain things like that, but indeed the linear economy, which is very much driven by the capitalist system, is going in that opposite direction. I think we have to acknowledge that the current metrics we have don't really measure well-being, but they measure economic success on a very aggregated level, which does not account for individual well-being, whether it's the well-being of individual people or communities or the well-being of our natural environment. And so I think I'm a strong advocate for highlighting more the other effects around capitalism or our capitalist market system, to make us more aware of the trade-offs that we are facing with the current system, which is it's a very big discussion. It's a very kind of theoretical discussion also, but I think maybe summing up, we have to make sure that we have our eye on the right price and not just on the fanciest metrics. And I do think that this also trickles down to culture and society.
Yeah, I think one model I've seen that is being used in many, especially developed economies, is business model. Business models tend to legitimize circularity and gives it validity. And for instance, in Finland, there are second-hand shops, right? And not just in Finland, many European countries already have that. And second-hand shop where you can actually get valued products. The fact that they are now operating as shops, they are legitimate businesses, I think it gives some kind of legitimacy, some kind of validity to the whole concept. So do you think that kind of modeling can perhaps change the media picture, which you alluded to earlier, especially in the developing economies, to be able to give them some kind of legitimacy that will encourage them to continue or to advance on their traditional secular models? And I use the word advance for very strategic reasons.
Yes, I think absolutely it can. So I just talked about how we need kind of our metrics for our economic system to move more towards a sustainability oriented perspective in order to just even make transparent the trade-offs that we have. And I think at the same time, the sustainability practices can move a little bit towards a more economic framing because there is economic opportunity there. And I think to frame it as such will also make it feel less like we are just humbly doing our little things, but we are actually creating economic and social and environmental value. And so I think this reframing it's something that also comes up in my research where I look at circular startups. So startups that are developing circular business models. And this is also a question that does come up there where the startups basically need to learn how to bring their ideas, which revolve around sustainability and circularity, into a framing that is kind of attractive to customers, to investors, and to other business partners. And I think this is the same kind of thing that can happen there. I think the basically economic and environmental side has to move towards each other, and I think these are something that they can do.
Great. Certain scholars have actually expressed concerns about genuine efforts versus empty gestures as it relates to this concept, very, very important concept. Now, in your thought, or in your opinion, do you think that the current push or the current strategy towards circular economy risks becoming another avenue for greenwashing, or are we actually on a real trajectory to a grounded change? Well, what's your opinion, or what do you think?
I would say yes and yes. So it is an avenue for change, but it is also already being used for greenwashing or circular washing, whatever you want to call it. And I think what's very important here is that we make sure we all know what we're talking about and that we're talking about the same things. And this relates to my work in standardization. Again, from this perspective, because in those standards, we try to define what actually is a circular economy. What does reusing mean? How is it different from remanufacturing? And to make it very clear, what are we talking about? And I do see research as well that is not being precise on those different terms. And then I'm not surprised when businesses, either knowingly or unknowingly, use this confusion that is going on in the terminology, in the principles, in the definitions, to make themselves look better than they maybe really are. And this is, I think, a lot of the greenwashing we see. I wouldn't even say it's intentional. I think some certainly is, but some is just a typical way marketing works. That's what I studied in my bachelor's, where you pick out the best things about something and you really amplify those. And that is a very normal marketing practice. And in itself, it's fine. But of course, when we're talking about something that is quite sensitive to many different outcomes, like circular economy, it's a very relevant topic for sustainability related outcomes. So CO2 emissions, for example, or water use. And once this kind of gets a marketing spin, we are in the territory of greenwashing within just 2 or 3 steps. It's very, very simple, very easy to get there. And so I think what can help is to stick to the right terminology, to make it very clear what we're talking about. And of course, certain regulations also help rein that in. But it's always both. It's always 2 sides of the same coin. There's progress, but there's also misuse or abuse of this new idea.
Great. Now, talking about standardization, I'd like us to go a little bit in there, especially as it relates to social justice. How do you ensure social justice in the context of this standardization?
That is a great question that is very difficult to answer. But first of all, maybe I can say from my experience with ISO that within every ISO project. Oh, maybe ISO is the International Standardization Organization based in Switzerland, and it organizes basically the people being sent from all countries around defining standards and creating this guidance for any kind of organization. So ISO does always highlight the SDGs that a certain standard adheres to, the Sustainable Development Goals. So you can always kind of say, you're always required actually when you're writing a new standard to justify which Sustainable Development Goals are addressed by that standard. So there is a certain mechanism to ensure some kind of sustainability and social social orientation of those standards. However, there's not a great mechanism to then ensure that those standards ultimately actually contribute to those goals. So there's definitely some issue there, but a much bigger discussion in the circular economy field is, should circular economy be only about the circulation of resources, or should it be about a much bigger picture of a more just and sustainable economy as a whole? And there we have to also distinguish between different fields. So what I understood is that in standardization, you want to be very specific and narrow about your standards, because if you redefine what sustainable means or what a sustainable circular economy is in each standard, and you add other things like CO2 emissions or wealth inequality or something, these kinds of metrics to each new standard, then you'll have a lot of different approaches to tackling these issues. So you really want to stick to one set of issues for each standard, but make sure you refer to other standards. And that's what we try to do in the circular economy standards. I think there's more integration to be made still, but that is kind of the standardization approach. But when you're a business or a country or a family, of course, it's important to not narrowly focus on one thing at a time, but to consider the trade-offs between different aspects, and of course also focus on the social aspects. But it's something that the circular economy community is always debating, whether that is something that should always be there, or if we should focus on creating circularity and then let others take care of the social aspect. But I think it's important to discuss always.
Interesting. Now, we talked about how the current dispensation seems to have been moving towards more capitalistic consumption patterns. But in this context, what do you think can be a way to shift people's mind from the already dominant take make waste model to a more long-standing stewardship kind of thinking, as a way to, actually really embedded circularity in our everyday lives?
Yeah.
Sorry, embedded.
I think to really get to a very high level of circularity and to really bring on a large part, if not all people, we need to talk about social justice and economic justice. I think that is ultimately what it comes down to, and this is a very big topic that I'm certainly not the most knowledgeable on, but I do believe that as long as half the population of a country, or large parts of the world population, have to really look at what they're spending on each individual item to put food on the table, to put clothes on their back, they will not look at the most sustainable option. They will look at the cheapest option. And for the cheapest option, it's usually the option that creates economic harm or ecological and social harm. If you're thinking of those very, very cheap fast fashion platforms. And the problem is always a short-term versus long-term perspective, right? Because if you buy a t-shirt for $1, then it will be cheaper than a t-shirt for $10 that might last you longer, but it will also probably break within a shorter period of time, so you have to buy another t-shirt for $1. But if you only have $1 to invest, you're not going to think about the long-term perspective and think about, well, if I buy this $10 t-shirt, it's going to last me as long as 10 $1 t-shirts, but you're going to think about what can I afford right now. And so I think this economic disparity between people who can make those conscious decisions and those who just simply cannot, I think this has to be addressed first. And I personally believe that we need to really think about whether we need billionaires in this world at a time when a lot of people do not have the freedom to make economic decisions that are more just and sustainable.
That's interesting to think about. What is one circular economy myth that you'd love to bust on this podcast?
I think one that I hear a lot is that circular economy means sustainability. And I even see this in research papers. So I do think it's important to raise this issue, especially as a circular economy professional. Because if something is circular, it's not always the most sustainable option. And we always need to look at those two aspects separately. I mean, we need to look at both of them for sure, but we cannot say as long as something is circular, it's already sustainable. So an example for that is chemical recycling, which in certain cases can be useful and can also be the most sustainable option. It is technically circular because what chemical recycling is you're basically breaking down plastics into the molecules, and you basically turn it back into oil. Very simplified. There's people who can explain this process better, but just to get an idea, it sounds attractive, right? To think, okay, we have oil, we make plastics, and then we turn the plastics back into oil. But this process is very inefficient. It creates a lot of losses, and it is also very energy intensive. And so this means that, yes, it is circular, but is it the most sustainable option? Probably not. And I think to make this distinction is very important, and I would like to see that more in everyday life. I would like to see this more from politicians, and I would like to see this more from researchers, that they are very clear on what they mean by circular, what they mean by sustainable.
Very important to draw that line, I think. Now, if more people would embrace circular economy or circular economic practices in their everyday life, what do you think would be the ripple effect in terms of business, culture, and even global policy?
I think if circularity forces you to think more systemically, and it forces you to think more long-term. And I think this is something that could benefit us in many different aspects. I mean, if I think about, for example, how mental health has been treated, and we're going in a good direction there, I think, at least in Germany, where I'm from, I can see that there is a kind of a mental shift from seeing it as something that's just a nuisance, or, if somebody has mental health issues, that it's just somebody who's sick and you cannot do anything about it, to going to a direction where we actually think more about prevention and dealing with mental health in a proactive way and in a constructive way. And I think that is one of those ripple effects that I think thinking about circularity can have, because when you embrace those circular economy principles, you will inevitably think about larger contexts and long-term effects in other areas as well, because it is a way, circularity is a way of thinking, systems thinking is a way of kind of changing your brain in a way that you see maybe a little bit beyond your own narrow scope. So I think that could be a huge effect, and I think if we fully switch to a circular economy, it will be, I think our economic system will work differently. We will have to collaborate more. I think we will have to question this hyper competition that we have. I think especially when I look at my research in entrepreneurship and startups, I think the startups that are moving towards circularity, they focus a lot more on collaborations, and they don't think so much about how can I undercut my my competition by offering a product that's cheaper at the moment, and then as soon as I have a monopoly, I raise my prices and I can get monopoly prices, which is ultimately how a lot of Silicon Valley startups operate. So I think this kind of economic model is not going to work in a circular economy, but I think overall we'll be better off for it. But we will have to see the how we structure this transition to a circular economy, whether it will create more justice or more injustice. I think that's really up to us.
Okay, as we begin to wrap up, what would be your call to action for individuals? I'd like to break it down into context. For instance, in the developed context and developing context, what would be your call to action? Okay. If you can also further break it down to individuals and then corporations.
Okay, so we have 4 categories?
Yes.
Well, I would say I'll start with my own context because I think that's maybe a little bit more easy for me. So I would say individuals in I like to say industrialized economies, because I think development is something that has been co-opted in a way that sounds a little bit like countries who are not very rich have no development, which is a very weird concept, I think, to think about, and it's a bit arrogant, actually. So maybe that's something that is a call to action for individuals in heavily industrialized economies such as Germany, to understand development as something that is not just GDP per capita. Yeah. And also to think about your privileges, think about what you can do individually. I would maybe say anybody living in a democratic country, which of course can be anywhere in the world. Make sure you interact with your representatives. Make sure you make your voice heard. Make sure that the topic of sustainability and also social justice are on the agenda of your political representatives, because I think that is the best way of really creating systemic change. Talk to other people about what they do in their everyday life, and I think this also goes for anybody in industrialized or less industrialized countries. Talk to people around you. Ask them what they do, how they make sure they save money and resources. And I think sharing good practices is always nice, and that's also something that goes for businesses. What I would say to companies in industrialized economies, and honestly any kind of organization trying to do something about circular economy, is also link up with others, because circular economy does not happen within one organization. Usually there are some very big conglomerates that are trying it, but I don't think that it will be a long-term solution. So I think you need to go meet with other like-minded business leaders, with other NGOs, with research institutions, get together and figure out how in your sector you can make a difference. And this can be creating a whole new value chain. It can also be finding your place in existing value chains and finding how you can contribute to a larger circularity. I think that's what I would say to businesses in general. And maybe to pick up on the point of this kind of second use or repairing as something that is something somehow shameful or not something to promote confidently, I would say think about the value that you are maintaining. Think about the value that you are actually adding to products. It's not just about value, is not just something that is newly created, even if marketing likes to present it as such. But value is also what we maintain. Value is what we safe from destruction. And so I think with this kind of mindset, it might be a little bit easier to confidently say, I repair shoes and I help people maintain their shoes that they probably have a relationship with. I know a lot of people who really love a pair of shoes that they bought somewhere, or maybe that they associate with a certain celebrity who wore those shoes, or whatever, and you can prolong or extend that relationship by repairing those shoes. And so I think that has a very, very emotional value, which is actually the perfect marketing tool as well. So I think to just connect those dots is something that can be quite powerful.
That's super interesting, and I think I would like to thank you for coming as we wrap up on that note. Except you have any final words, but I think that was my last question.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I would say maybe as final words, circular economy is not something where you go from 0 to 100, and nobody does, really. Maybe some startups try to, but then they realize they need a lot of partners to make their vision come true, so even they have to build it bit by bit. And so I think staying engaged, interacting with people, and making your voice heard is probably the best thing you can do. And I hope more people do that.
Great. It's been a pleasure having you, and I'm sure that everyone has gotten something to learn and apply in their everyday lives, especially as it relates to these very important and timely concepts. So thank you very much. And to our viewers, please remember to subscribe to this channel, like the video, and share your thoughts in the comment section.